Okay, if I could have your attention, please, and welcome you all to the Foreign Correspondents Club of Thailand. This is a Monday night. Our flagship programs are usually on Wednesdays, but we've got a very busy week this week, and on Wednesday we'll have Teddy Spa Palestira talking about his book on Ho Chi Minh, which he's been working on. It's the second time he's done a book on Ho Chi Minh, and he's become obsessed with it. I highly recommend it. It's a very interesting topic. Ho Chi Minh is one of the most significant figures in 20th century Southeast Asian figure. It's hard to think of a leader that's more important, Lee Kuan Yew, possibly. But anyway, a very, very interesting topic, and he's really got into it, done a lot of research. And the reason he became interested is that Ho Chi Minh spent 2 years in Thailand in 1928 to 29, less than that actually, probably about 16 months, when he came back from his world travels. And so he prepared the revolution in Vietnam, the whole effort to get rid of the French, on Siamese soil near a place called Pitchit, which is up country. So it's a sort of forgotten piece of history, but it's actually very intriguing, and he's done a very good thing. He's probably the most productive Thai writer in English in terms of output of work today, and he's 87 and in tremendous shape. So that's on Wednesday. And then on Thursday we have Tabiye, I made a mess of that, but it's a film about the creative resistance in Myanmar, and it takes a look at how people are fighting the junta in a different way, and it's called artivism instead of activism. But anyway, it's going to be good. And we have 4 speakers coming in, including a representative from the National Unity Government. And then one other thing I would highlight, apart from, the other thing to look forward to is that the governor of the Tourism Authority of Thailand will be coming to speak to us on the 2nd of October, that's a Thursday. She's very interesting. Thailand's economy is in a mess, tourism is in an even bigger mess, so there's a lot to discuss. And so to this evening, where we're going to hear from Stephen Simmons, who is a retired British soldier with a long military record, about 16 years, a stockbroker. And in his latest incarnation, he has become a writer and has done a number of interesting books. One of them is Maimyo Days, which is about the hill station in Burma, where the Burma army today has its Sandhurst, where it actually trains everybody. But Stephen's book is about a period before that when lots of Brits went there and lived, and they were quite interesting characters. The book we're going to hear about tonight is Cambodia's Swinging Sixties, which takes a look at the golden period, quotation marks, in Cambodian history, the peak period under Sihanouk, before the Vietnam War started eating in over the Ho Chi Minh Trail and all that stuff, and the great Lon Nol American-backed coup in 1970. So it's a period of great activity and creativity. And Stephen has been pursuing this topic, how long is it now? 10 years?
Something like that, yeah.
Yeah, very long time. So it's an obsession that's now a book, which is something to celebrate. Stephen.
Thank you very much, Dominic. Good evening, and thank you all for being here. And my thanks, of course, to the FCC for inviting me to talk to you about that extraordinary, modern, outward-looking, now lost Cambodia of the 1960s, about its stunning modern villas, its art, its music, its cinema, and other things which made the country then so successful. It is a privilege to speak in this club, which has such standing and history in Southeast Asia, and I'm most grateful.
Stephen, can you just get a bit more on mic?
Yeah.
Just pull it up towards you.
Boop, boop, boop.
The mic, not you.
It won't go any further. How's that? Is that working? Thank you. Okay, it is terribly easy to become lost down a myriad of fascinating rabbit holes when looking back into the past, particularly if you find photographs of normal, simple, everyday life, which is, of course, the life which most of us lead, and can therefore identify with photographs of families in the garden, or of shops, or of cafes, or of children in the park, or at school, or policemen, or bicycles, of whatever, the stuff of everyday life. But then, when we gaze back at a society which became confronted with cataclysm, then these images take on a profoundly melancholic hue. They can haunt you. One minute there's a society of families going about their normal everyday life, and suddenly there isn't. It's all gone. The writer Max Egremont immersed himself in this melancholy when he went to what was East Prussia, which had been settled by the Teutons for over 600 years. He found derelict Prussian houses, abandoned Lutheran churches, graves, and ghosts. The Germans, of course, entirely gone. And it haunted Egremont, and he wrote Forgotten Land, a book of extreme loss, really. I sensed similar complete loss some years ago when I buried myself down in the bowels of the bibliothèque in Phnom Penh. No books, of course. The Khmer Rouge burnt all of them. But there were, tucked away behind musty old boxes and musty old librarians, many dumped, unfiled, 50-year-old copies of Cambodia Today and Cambodge Aujourd'hui, the Cambodian equivalent of the Times Supplement or the Bangkok Post leisure section. Lots of photographs of long dead people and newspaper cuttings of the Cambodia of the 60s. They too were hugely evocative and equally haunting because those photographs and newspaper cuttings were also full of ghosts. This era of the 60s became known as the Golden Period, a period of post-colonial optimism, of bright, fresh modernism in its art, in its music, and in its architecture. And all this was combined with very considerable economic success, all of which came to such a violent, as most of you know, violent, traumatizing, and utter end in 75. Later that day, after I emerged from the bibliothèque, later that day, I met a charming French woman of a certain age. She'd lived there in Phnom Penh throughout the 60s, then a city of tree-lined boulevards, still is to a degree, cafes and Indochine chic. And for a few moments, she was almost lost for words to describe the city then, until she said it was paradis perdu, paradise lost. And I was reminded of L.P. Hartley's often quoted line, "The past is a foreign country. They do things differently there." And quite clearly, they really did do things differently there then in Cambodia during the Golden Period. But that fascinating society about which I've written eventually became doomed by war and by a regime made distinct by its quite extraordinarily medieval brutality, and it pretty much ceased to exist. And what I've attempted to do, primarily via the social and creative centres of Phnom Penh and Khmer, is simply construct an image of that period to show some of the good which they achieved and to bring some of the dead, albeit briefly, back to life. And in so doing, show you a little of the positive from that post-colonial burst of Khmer creativity, which was so successfully fostered in the 60s. And also to show something of that which still remains after the final terrible fall in 75. It really must have been a lovely place in so many ways. In River of Time, John Swain describes his life in Saigon and Phnom Penh in 75, when all three Indochina capitals fell, respectively, to the Pathet Lao, the North Viets, and the Khmer Rouge, within weeks of one another. And although his book is very much about that specific year, he also makes crystal clear just what a wonderful country Cambodia was then. He describes Phnom Penh as a ravishing Indo-Chinese town. And he makes clear just how cultured and developed a society Cambodia had become. And he despaired at the loss of a society which he knew to be fabulous, really. To John Swain, ravishing. To the historian David Chandler, Phnom Penh then had a sunstruck provincial elegance. So I began to wonder just what kind of country Cambodia was in the 60s. What had been lost? I wondered just why Lee Kuan Yew, who ran what became one of the world's most successful economies, I wondered why on a visit to Phnom Penh in 68, looking around him rather forlornly, he said that one day he wanted his country, Singapore, to look just like this, Cambodia. What was lost? What did we miss? Well, the biggest loss, and we didn't miss it, the biggest loss was the number of people, of course, a third of the population. Unfortunately, it was more than the bald, awful figures suggest. The people the Khmer Rouge targeted were what they termed the new people, the city dwellers, people who did new things like being engineers or doctors or teachers or business owners, basically anybody who did not work in the fields. And sadly for Cambodia, it was these new people who were, of course, the artists, the architects, the poets, the writers, the dancers. And if I may, I shall read a small passage from the book. I interviewed an artist by the name of Suo Sadavi, who survived the Khmer Rouge, unlike 4 of his 8 siblings. And he describes, pretty powerfully I think, he describes who the Khmer Rouge hunted down. When they came, they took me and all my family, my parents and brothers and sisters, to the fields to work. From April 75 until 79, all education was banned in the country, particularly art. All schools had been closed. The most well-educated professors and the country's most skilled and valuable human resources were sent to die. People like doctors, nurses, teachers, policemen, soldiers, and university students. Students and teachers of the Royal University of Fine Art had all been sent to work in the rice fields, whether they were capable of hard physical work or not. The Khmer Rouge forced them to work hard, and if they did not work as hard as they were told to do, they were sent away to be killed. The art university was shut down. No more singing, no dancing, no entertaining for people who used to live and work there. They were all made to live like criminals in jail. Husbands and wives were not allowed to talk to one another. Many Khmer Rouge soldiers were very young. Many were 14 or 15 or 16 years old. Everything was more hard than in the film Killing Fields, more hard. All kinds of art material was destroyed, including musical instruments, tapes, and old records. Similar, all singers, composers, writers, and editors were forced to work in the rice fields. Even worse, they would be killed if the genocide, by which he means the Khmer Rouge, found out that they had been famous during the earlier regimes. People such as singers, actors, actresses, dancers, drama performers, models, artists, and cartoonists. Also cinemas, museums, any form of state offices, Parliament itself was destroyed, and the whole city was turned into forest of ghosts. Now I ask, the Khmer Rouge did for who? For who? Why? I don't know. I don't know. Pretty grim. So let's look at what the Khmer Rouge tried to destroy. And as a start, if I can make this work, which I cannot. Yes, I can. Technology. This is Phnom Penh in the late 60s. Absolutely beautiful, I think, magical photograph. If that appeared in the sort of travel sections of Western newspapers, you would be hard pushed to get a seat on an aeroplane. A beautiful sight. What was so special about it? Well, in simple terms, in the late 50s and throughout the 60s, Cambodia was one of the most advanced and successful countries in Asia. In simple, boring, but important economic terms, Cambodia's economy was successful. Here I need to give you a trigger warning, all right? Because I'm going to mention some numbers, and that normally makes people either fall asleep or leave the room. Please do neither. Australian government figures from the early 1960s showed GNP at 120 US ahead. That made Cambodia the 5th richest out of the 17 measured economies in the survey. And GDP growth averaged 5% a year from 55 to 70, which is to say that the economy almost doubled in size over the period. Not exciting, indeed, unless you're an economist, but clearly important and relevant to the people who benefited. Why the success and progress? What was so right about Cambodia in the late 50s and 60s? Well, the French did have a fair amount to do with it. They were not great colonists, which of course begs the question in the minds of some, were any colonists any good? A political question not part of this book, thank God, nor one which I will want to get involved in. But still, as colonists go, the French were really extractors. What they added was largely for their own benefit, and the spin-off to the locals was almost incidental. But positive spin-off there was, in terms of French architecture, French food, French culture generally, and later on access to French universities. But the main reason why the country flourished post-independence until the late 60s, in my view, was because of this well-intentioned, highly cultured, flawed, often praised, often criticized man, Prince Norodom Sihanouk. Oh my God. I was actually taught how to do this before I started. It's so simple. There are 2 buttons. You can't really get it wrong, but I've managed to do that. Anyway, that's not what I'm seeing. This photograph was taken by the late, I think, great Tim Page at Independence Day in Independence Day Parade in 1968. Sihanouk led his country to what became inevitable independence in 55, following the French defeat at Dien Bien Phu the year before, and then promptly abdicated. The Council of the Throne replaced him with his father. Sihanouk formed a political party, which is why he abdicated. More of a movement than a party, really, called the Sankum Rishonium. It governed the country with Sihanouk at its head for the next 15 years. He was an arch-Francophile, partly French-educated, and yet entirely comfortable and happy in his own Cambodian skin. And his aim throughout the 15-year Sankum period was to portray to the world a modern, artistic, cultured, and crucially independent, non-aligned country. Good luck with that, as we would say now. He did try hard, no question. He encouraged, and the state financed, young students to go to Paris, some to study art or filmmaking, others architecture or engineering, perhaps most importantly for Cambodia's cultural legacy. He appointed the Corbusier school-trained and quite brilliant Van Mollevan as the state's principal architect. Cambodia hosted international film festivals. They held a huge international exhibition in Phnom Penh shortly after independence. They took an exhibition to London to the South Bank. They went from almost no tractors to 600 tractors in just a few years. That is important. It wasn't all joy. There were certainly political excesses and many costly errors throughout the 15-year period, and the state's security apparatus, under its hardline leader, Kurun, and with the presumed knowledge of Sihanouk, often acted with great brutality. Although I must stress that this book doesn't aim to deal with the detailed politics. Other more qualified writers have done so. Now, I worked in Phnom Penh for a little while, but on business, you don't see much more than meeting rooms and phones. You only see the now. That's all you see. And the first I saw of the real modernity and flair of the country from the golden period was around 15 years ago, when my wife and I and some friends drove from Bangkok to the border of Phoi Phet, on down to Phnom Penh, on down to the coast to beautiful Khet. Nearly 4 hours, Phnom Penh to Khet. It was a road of potholes. It was dreadful. I'm still recovering from it. I'm sure the rest of us are. 40 years earlier, we could have jumped on this and got there in a bit over 2 hours, which gives the first clue as to how advanced and developed the country was becoming. Brand new modernist train station in Kampot, 2 hours on that train. Fantastic. They were heading here, Khet. That's a photograph from the late 60s, high days and holidays. We'd booked a villa, which, as it turned out, was run by I've written here mildly eccentric, but I think wildly eccentric, but charming Frenchman, in fact. I'm not sure what we were expecting when we rented the villa, something tail-end Art Deco maybe, given Cambodia being a French colony, but whatever we were expecting, miles from anywhere, on the coast of Cambodia, staring out to the Gulf of Siam, it certainly wasn't this. And that. than that. Not to everybody's taste, certainly not to the taste of a traditionalist Georgian junkie, but this classic of Corbusier design, which if in Europe would be listed to the point where you probably couldn't even live there, it wasn't uncommon to find those in the Cambodia of the 50s and 60s. This one was in fact designed by an architect called Lu Ban Hap, whose miraculous escape from the Khmer Rouge I describe in the book. He was one of the three great Cambodian architects, along with Van Mullivan and Mam Sopanar. Again, this on the coast of a small, at that time, not well-known country, and built over 50 years ago. It had been built for a Madame Niem, who with her husband, had built up a successful pharmaceuticals business in the 60s. When the Khmer Rouge took Kep in the early 70s, they stole her house and then executed her. Also in Kep, an unknown architect built this, the Blue House. Not sure who lived there because most people are dead and records were destroyed by the KR as a matter of policy, but we do know it was either the governor of Kep, the head of customs, or a member of Sihanouk's family. Built 50 years ago, and it wouldn't look out of place in Berlin or in parts of London. Everybody loved Kep Khmer. It was a seaside escape, which was everything to everyone. It was swallows and Amazons country, enjoyed hugely by families, but it was also so uber chic that the likes of Catherine Deneuve were regulars, and Jackie Kennedy popped in once or twice. Not every house survived in Kep, of course, far from it. This is typical of many in Kep, burned out by the KR and gradually being eaten by the jungle. But Phnom Penh, being the capital, was the center of things, and the majority of Cambodia's brave New World buildings went up there. Sihanouk launched a huge infrastructure development program, which included the construction of everything you'd imagine, really. Roads, bridges, factories, airports, schools, the lot, and a deep water port in Sihanoukville. And to ensure that much of it happened in the style he desired, modern with Khmer roots, he appointed as chief architect and head of urban planning the brilliant L'École des Beaux-Arts trained Van Mullivan, who over the following 13 years oversaw the creation of over 100 buildings designed both to illustrate and facilitate Cambodia's transformation from rural-based peasant state to modern industrialized economy. And that's Van Mullivan. He was born in Kampot province in 26, educated at the Lycée Sisawat in Phnom Penh, and then studied architecture at l'École des Beaux-Arts. He favored and concentrated on modern interpretations of vernacular architecture, architecture which seeks to use local materials and to satisfy local needs and crucially local conditions, particularly climatic conditions. Designs which allowed for plentiful air and light became a constant theme running throughout his work. He returned to Cambodia in 56 after 2 years in Paris, and he set to work almost immediately. And the freshness and cultural relevance of his designs, which he described as the modern movement adapted to the Khmer context, caught both the national mood and then quite quickly Sihanouk's eye. He became a trusted favorite of Sihanouk, was responsible for many of the buildings which went up during this time. And incidentally and happily for me, his daughter Delphine was kind enough to write the foreword to my book, for which I'm grateful. In Phnom Penh, Van Mullivan built this, the Olympic Stadium. I think he put that up in about 2 and a bit years. I can guarantee you in England that would take 15 years and 30 planning committees. That, Brise Soleil, air and light. And he built this, the Chatumak Conference Hall, and this, the National Theatre. I think that's now gone. And in Kiri Rom, Lu Ban Hap, who I mentioned earlier, this is him. The ugly bloke on the right is me. That's Lu Ban Hap on the left in the shades. In Kirirom, that was in Paris, incidentally. I went to interview him there. He built this. I love that house. I want that house. I want the house. I want the car. I want both, but I can't have either. And it makes me very, very envious. And he built this. That was his house in Phnom Penh. Now, he came from Kampuchea, schooled in Phnom Penh, and then in L'École des Rôles in Saint-Germain, which was a civil engineering and public works college. He met Van Mollivan in Paris. He persuaded him to complement what he'd learned at L'École des Rôles by moving on to study architecture. He took to his new subject immediately, and by the time he qualified in '59, he was so taken with modernism that he nearly went to work for Oscar Niemeyer in Brazil, who was busy building the new capital, Brasilia. It was Sunak himself who persuaded him not to do so. Sunak, of course, realizing that Cambodia very much needed Liu Banhap's talents. Extraordinary buildings, not built in 1960s Germany or Switzerland, not houses built by Frank Lloyd Wright students in 1960s America, but in Cambodia in the 60s, in a region which had become the almost tortured center, epicenter of the Cold War, and yet still this brilliance was happening in Cambodia. And if you're a child of the 60s or 70s and you lived in the Far East, then you recognize these houses or this style. This 60s modernism was common in Singapore, in Ipoh big time, and still there to a fair degree. In Hong Kong, even in the army, in 48 Gurkha Brigade Officers' Mess in Sekong, where I spent a few years, was all straight lines, big windows, and functionality. So you kind of grew up with it, really. Expected to see it, but to see modernist European in Kep, when the French had left in the early 50s, big surprise. Anyway, from Kep on to Phnom Penh, Foreign Correspondents Club, Mekong River, veranda, a couple of glasses of Aussie Shiraz. The barman was also of a certain age. He put some music on, it was rather nice. A woman singing, softly, something haunting about her voice. And I asked him who she was, and he said it was her on the left, Rossere Satea. I asked him if she still sang in the clubs in Phnom Penh, and he looked a little downcast and said she was dead. She too had been murdered by the Khmer Rouge in the late 70s. Now, that's just two people on that trip so far, Madame Niem and Rossere Satea dead, and two people cannot make a pattern, except for the fact here they can, because they represented a type of Franco-Khmer society, which the Khmer Rouge spent over 4 years trying to destroy so thoroughly that unless you really dig, read and ask questions, you don't know much about it, because they're almost, but thankfully not, completely all gone. Onto art, I'm aware of time, onto art. Sihanouk encouraged art in all its forms. He sent dozens of budding artists, architects and cinematographers to Paris to study at l'École des Beaux-Arts. And he was responsible for the hiring of a Japanese modernist artist named Suzuki to teach at the University of Fine Art. One of the best from the time, and one of Suzuki's students was a man named Nek Dim. Standard art from the time in Southeast Asia was often of the monks and palm trees school. Not in Cambodia, it wasn't. This is Nek Dim. He was from Praving province, educated at the Cambodian School of Art in Phnom Penh, and he quickly proved himself to be hugely talented. He became a member of the Association of Modern Khmer Artists, along with fine artists Sam Yuen and Men Makot, and with political cartoonists Kut Kun and Hoi Hem. There was a wealth of talent amongst his peer group, but it was Nek Dim who was widely thought of as being the most prominent fine artist of his time. And he produced paintings like this. That's called Mother. That is Family. That stunner is Beach at Kep. That's River Village. And lastly, this one is touching because she's got her eyes closed, Bride. Markets tend to work. Some of these were selling for up to 11,000 US in the early 70s. You can do the inflation-adjusted maths yourselves to see what people would pay for them now. Nek Dim illustrates perfectly what there was in Cambodian fine art, and then again the lost. He was executed in 78. The country also produced some superb, well ahead of their time, political cartoonists. Kut Kun, Hoi Hem, two of the most prolific. And this first one shows Hoi Hem's take on what will happen to the Philippines when they become inveigled into the Vietnam War. It shows LBJ as an undertaker measuring the country up for their national coffin, along with South Korea, Australia, and the others all leaning up against the wall. And here is his view of LBJ's latest peace offensive. And these cartoonists were not remotely parochial in their comment, even though you might well forgive them for being so, given the region was awash with war. In this next one, he celebrates Portugal's Marcelo Caetano's liberalization policies, whom he shows welcoming the baby of democracy in his country after he took over as prime minister from the hardline Salazar in 68. Behind him, there's a general saying, "Don't push your luck too far, mate." Amazing to produce these things. No internet, long-distance calls you had to book 3 hours ahead, and they were producing this sort of stuff. Sad to say, you probably guessed it, both of these political cartoonists died at the hands of the KR. And if we think Hong Kong's film industry was massive, Bruce Lee and all that, which of course it was, it still had nothing on Cambodia. The country made around 350 films from 55 to the early 70s. Some became wildly popular to the point that Cambodian film broke Run Run Shaw's stranglehold on film distribution in Hong Kong. This actress, the extravagantly named Saxi Sabong, was a great favorite. She survived the KR years. This beauty, and by all accounts, great actress Vichara Dani, did not survive. I think the end came for her in 78 as well. This is Sihanouk acting in one of his own films, to little or no critical acclaim, if we are to be accurate, but he's wearing a nice suit and I like the car. And film posters plastered all over the place, in Phnom Penh, in Battambang, in Siem Reap. And they produced so much music in the 60s, and music of really good quality, that the US producer John Perozzi spent 2 or 3 years of his life making a film about it called Don't Think I've Forgotten. The most well-known from the time, and you still hear their music being played in Cambodia, were this chap, Sin Sissamut. That's from a record cover, obviously. Typical, absolute 1960s crooner. And again, this woman, Ross Saray Satea. As I said, murdered in 78. She was dubbed the Golden Voice by Sihanouk. She was beautiful, petite, a whisperer over 5 foot tall, talented, and to the social diarists, at least, appealingly tragic. She did not so much epitomize as quite simply be the defining look and voice of Franco Khmer chic as she sang to the gilded in the clubs. She sang locally in Battambang, where she was from, then moved to Phnom Penh, always on national radio. She sang with Sin Sissamut more often than not. Most record covers from the time show the two of them together. Neither she nor Sissamut survived. So much work back then, so much. Let me just rattle through a few more before we all attack the bar. Cambodia, naturally, ballet and dance. At the beginning of the 60s, ballet was run on a shoestring. It needed some help if it was to thrive. And again, it was Sihanouk who stepped in to do so by declaring 254 hitherto part-time members of the Court of Ballet to be civil servants and eligible, therefore, for much-needed salaries alongside their new full-time jobs. Princess Bhupadevi was the... hang on. Oh, sorry, that's another one. I'm not sorry, because it's lovely. That's another one I should have shown you of Ross Serraceter from a record cover. That's Bhupadevi. And her again. And here she is dancing for the de Gaulles. You can see de Gaulle's wife on the left. I think to his right, behind his impressively substantial nose, I think that's Mitterrand's wife. You can see the king there, you can see a Sihanouk, and you can see Bhupadevi on the right. Cambodia was even quick off the mark with tourism. Tourism was a great earner of the 60s. Sihanouk and others quickly realized the value of high-margin visitors. Cambodia was not backpacker country then. And you don't get much more high-end, high-margin than people like, whoops, slow again. Sorry, that was her dancing with Margaret, for Margaret. You don't get much more high-end or high margin than this. This is an Air France ad. I think this service ran for about a year and a half from France into Siem Reap. That actually is a bar on an airplane. Can you imagine the luxury of that? Yeah? They spend a few quid, those people. And of course, everyone wanted to go here. Angkor Wat. Very different shot of it from then, with obviously much less foliage. It's about 1967, that one, I think. And as for industrial development, well, most developing countries then were largely soft commodities, maybe plastics. Cambodia, well, to a degree it was, but only to a degree. This is from a sales brochure of a company called Khmer, which is still in existence and is now owned by RM Asia, or RMA, a Bangkok-based company, which some of you may know. Car sales and diagnostics, bottom left of the page. Basic petrochems to the right. Consumer tech sales, bottom right. This is an advancing economy. This is one which is doing well. And the normal daily life in the 60s for the middle classes, I will stress the middle classes, but again, I'll stress both French and Cambodian. It was very modern, urban French, really. They shopped here at the Magazine d'Etat, Harrods, essentially. Bought lots of this, I guess. I love that old ad. Had dinner in places like this. I love that photograph. Very atmospheric of its time. And there. And they went to schools like this, the Lycée Descartes. Even in the countryside, where people undoubtedly had less money and did not enjoy the fruits of a growing economy quite so much, even here, education improved hugely. And that is because Sihanouk increased spending on education from 10% of GDP average in the 50s to 17% by 64. That is proper governance. I wish we could do some of that in the UK. But all good things come to an end. Nowhere in Southeast Asia could escape the sheer enormity of the war in Vietnam and its often disastrous results, not the least of which for Cambodia was the dropping of nearly 3 million tons of bombs on around 113,000 sites over a 7 to 8 year period, as the US Air Force did all it could to disrupt the Ho Chi Minh Trail, much of which unfortunately for both Laos and Cambodia lay not in Vietnam itself, but in the east of those two countries. The beginning of the end came in 1970 when Sihanouk was deposed in a coup by Lon Nol, civil war for the next 5 years, and then came the Khmer Rouge, and that was the end of everything. Phnom Penh fell 17th of April, 75. So look, in sum, Cambodia in the 60s really was an extraordinary society. To Van Molivan, there was then an unprecedented creative dynamism in Cambodia after a long period of decline. The country was the envy of much of Southeast Asia. And the book is about the loss of that society, not merely of damage to, but of the virtual wipeout of an entire social and economic infrastructure of a settled way of life, almost as if the Cambodia of the then had been expunged from history. But it has not been completely so. And I've attempted in this book to bring some of that quite extraordinary society back to life. And this, for many, is how it all ended. That Phnom Penh in 75. That is, I find, a really touching photograph. There's a wee boy there holding an airline bag, which we all used to buy or be issued with in the 70s and 60s. It sort of hints at going on holiday. Well, he's not going on holiday. He's not going anywhere. Soldier having his last fag. He's been fighting for God knows how long, and there's a mother trying to keep her family together, distraught. It's a great photograph. And this photograph of Kep in the mid-60s showed just how lovely it was, and is perhaps a nicer shot on which to finish. And that's it. Thank you for your time.
Well, thanks very much, Stephen, for that. If you look back at this period, this golden age as it's called, you've shown us pictures of Phnom Penh, Kep, Battambang, Siem Reap, Bokor, all these places that did indeed develop. But how typical was it for the whole country? I mean, Eastern Cambodia was a very rough place then.
Yeah, it wasn't entirely typical. It was representative, I think, of an economy and a society which was trying to grow, trying to develop economically and artistically, and I think was really doing rather well under Sihanouk, who had so much stacked against him. But it wasn't for the most enormous part of society, which I think you might be suggesting. You're absolutely right, Dominic. It wasn't for the most enormous part of society. But then at the end, I showed you the slide of the young children going to school out in the sticks. And I explained that he increased spending on education from 10% to 17% of GDP over a 10-year period, during which time, as the economy was growing at 5%, more numbers. I like numbers. I was a stockbroker. I'm so sorry. It was growing at 5% a year. So, you know, if you think of the cumulative effect, it was tremendous. So he was trying. It wasn't across the whole country. He couldn't work magic. The people there couldn't work magic. Yeah, I hope that answers it.
Yeah. Okay. It was undoubtedly a remarkable period, and I've seen documentaries of all these factories going into operation, manufacturing everything from tires to pharmaceuticals, and so, you know, it's undeniable. But the idea that it was a Halcyon society is open to question. I mean, the Sihanouk secret police were fairly ruthless.
Yeah.
And Khieu Samphan at one stage was chased naked through the streets of Phnom Penh. I mean,
was it?
Yeah, didn't you?
No.
But I mean, things happened.
Glad
things went bump in the night. I mean, is that excusable, given the upside?
No, it's not excusable. It's not excusable. And as I explained, I mean, there were certainly errors. He did bear down hard on his opponents under the very hardline Kurun. Yes, he did. And he got very fed up with the Brits and the Americans, who he saw as having failed to deliver what the 1954 or 55 peace accords promised, which was a neutral country. So he burnt the embassies in the mid-60s. He burnt the British embassy, and I think he almost completely burnt the American embassy. So No, it was not all sweetness and light, no. But I think he had it, I think he and the Cambodians had it stacked against them. I think it was a tough gig, as people say now. It was tricky, hellish so.
Right, we've got a microphone, as usual, at the back of the room, so if you want to ask a question, please do so. Whilst you all race to it, I'll ask another question.
I hope it's not a difficult one, Dominic.
No, would I do that to you? It's amazing that you've latched onto this and taken such an interest in it and pursued a hobby in this way. When you look at contemporary Cambodia, which has a population that is phenomenally young, I mean, I think half of it is about 30 or less, who have no knowledge of the Khmer Rouge, no recollection, which is a good thing, and certainly no recollection of Cambodia in the 60s. How much interest is there amongst the next generation, the current generation, in their own history, their cultural development?
I think not much. I think not much at all. I think they're absolutely not educated about what happened at all. I would think that in the history books the words Khmer Rouge do not exist. I would think that they are not told about the terror from 75 to 79. And I would think also that they are probably not educated about the glory days, or what some people saw as the glory days of the 1960s. So the answer is no, they're not told about it. And there are very few people left who remember anything about it, for the absolutely bloody awful fact is that they were killed. And that's the most dreadful thing. It is really awful. It's so hard to find anyone to talk about it because they're all dead. Everyone they knew is dead. I found one horrific stat. I've got so many stats in the back of that book that I was going half blind when I was putting it together. In 75, there were 720 university lecturers, assistant lecturers, deputy lecturers, academics, shall we call them, 720. At the end of the terror, there were 30 left. That's all the brain's gone. That's your seed corn gone. The brain has disappeared. All those artists I show you, all the artists I showed you there. He was killed. All the singers I showed you, all killed, except for a woman called, help me, Sai Dang, Syding, Sai Dang, Sai Dang. It was. I'll find her name after this. Well, she survived, but the vast majority didn't. I mean, everyone. People just did not survive. The political cartoonists I showed you, all dead. Yeah. I came across a horror stat from Tuol Sleng. Obviously, being good communists, they do all sorts of things. Those sort of communists, but they're good at making records. And you'll have all seen that photograph, I guess, on the front of The Lost Executioner, of the woman with a black and white, and she's got a child there. It's a shocking photograph. She knew what was coming her way, and clearly it did come her way. Why am I talking about that? What am I rambling on about? The communists making records, and they made extremely good records of what they were doing and who they were killing. And in this record I found of the dead from Tuol Sleng, it went doctor, government official, civil servant, teacher. They really hated teachers. Teacher, soldier, on and on like that. Basically anyone with a brain, bang. So the collective memory has gone because they're dead. There's a few left, but not many. Isn't that right, Lan? Yeah, I mean, they've gone. So as for the children being educated about it, very little hope, I would think.
There was an interesting picture that you had of the lycée in Phnom Penh, with all the young, they were all girls.
Yeah.
But what was interesting about it was that they were all integrated, and that there were French and European students there. If you look at that, that's
Absolutely.
a real mixed bag.
As it should be.
Yeah,
And as
no,
it
I'm
was.
not.
Absolutely.
I'm just
No,
saying that's the way it
you're-
was.
I'm agreeing with you, Dominic, and it's excellent. It sort of illustrates the Phnom Penh of the then rather well, I think.
Good. So we can have a serious question there.
Hi, thank you.
Just introduce yourself.
Hi, my name is Chris. I've been living in Cambodia actually for the last 12 years.
Well, this could be a tricky one then if you've been there for the last 12
So,
years.
I can confirm that in the primary and secondary education, there is no teaching of the Khmer Rouge history.
Yeah.
It's a couple of paragraphs,
Yeah.
and it just moves by very quickly, which is unfortunate. So, wow, this is amazing, and thank you so much for putting this together. It's really fantastic to have this documented and memorialized, because that was really a marvelous period, I think, in world history. So my question for you is, in your research, did you find, so Cambodia knew so much about the rest of the world, and fashion, art, dance, music came to Cambodia. How much was the rest of the world aware of what was happening in Cambodia? Did you find reports of that? And just interested in how much Cambodia influenced outside. I know Jacqueline Kennedy Onassis came in 1967, and that was very widely covered in all the global fashion magazines. But anyway, that's the...
I think it depends on where you're from. America knew an awful lot about it, obviously, because they were heavily engaged in a war next door and in a war to the north in Laos, and as time moved on in a war in Cambodia, on the eastern side of Cambodia. So I think America knew a lot about it. The French absolutely did. There were still 10,000 French living in Cambodia up until 1974. The British less so, because the British sort of a stamping ground, if you like, in Southeast Asia, or in the whole of Asia, the bigger Asia, was very much Malaysia, Malaya as was until 63, and Singapore and Hong Kong. So it depended very much where you were from. But the French, absolutely, because they loved it. The Americans, absolutely, because they were heavily engaged in it next door. Yeah. As for the rest of the world, I don't know. I wouldn't hazard a guess. I think much less so in those days, because of course there was no internet. Communications was so very difficult, which is why I find the fact that Kut Kun and Hoi Hem, the political cartoonists, were actually writing about what was going on in Portugal. You know, when you literally had to book a long distance call 8 hours ahead. Yeah? No internet. How are these people doing it? Really developed, really, really clever people. Really, yeah.
Sam.
Sam Wright, club member. Thank you for your presentation. The Australian historian Chandler wrote a book called Brother Number One.
Yeah.
So these are his thoughts that I'm going to, and his observations. Pol Pot was head of the Communist Party during the period you're lamenting. And it was run by the Chinese. And he wanted to arm. The Chinese would not let him have arms unless he came to China and explained what he wanted to do. So, according to Chandler, he worked his way to Hanoi, and Hanoi got him up to Mao. And Mao had a big dinner with him and with Zhou Enlai, and he explained that what you're describing as progressive, he saw as neo-colonialism, cultural colonialism, and economic colonialism, and political colonialism that excluded the Khmer. And Mao gave him guns, gave him ammunition, gave him total support, saying yes. So one of his first acts in the revolution was to empty the city of Phnom Penh. If you've seen the photos, not a dog, not a cat, not an animal of anything. They marched everyone out because it was a foreign city, mostly with foreigners and no Khmer. And so the question then is, this world, according to Chandler, was a colonial world, just a neo-colonial world. And there was something wrong with it in terms of here's what the response was.
That's an enormous question. You're asking whether during the Sihanouk years it was tantamount to being a neo-colonial world. Is that what you're asking, sir? Or suggesting?
That's what Chandler is saying.
Okay.
Yes, that all of this progress, all this cultural domination was Western, not Khmer, didn't do anything for the Khmer people. Mao agreed and gave him weapons and guns and says, go to it.
Well, if Mao agreed, then, you know, he was probably wrong, because he didn't get an awful lot right himself. That's not how I see it. I don't see the 60s as under Norodom Sihanouk as being tantamount to a sort of quasi-colony. Certainly influences. As I said, he was very much a Francophile, but he was also very much a Cambodian, uncomfortable in his Cambodian skin. So I see influences, but not colonization.
Also, an important point is that the Khmer Rouge were French educated. So you really have to wonder what was going on at that time. Khieu Samphan, Pol Pot was an electrician studying electrical engineering in Paris. Not very high caliber, but they all were French educated. And so the distortion that's going on is quite spectacular.
Pol Pot, through his influence in the communist elements of the royal family, was sent to Paris for education. He went one day, and then he never went to school anymore. He went to join the Communist Party in France. And then he came back, and that's when he wanted to get the ammunition and guns and went to China, and they gave it to him.
Sure, but his education in communism took place in Paris, so even if he wasn't formally at university and attending his courses as he should have been, he was certainly deriving a lot from French intellectuals and communists and what have you. Question?
Matthew, I'm a data scientist. I have a question about the films.
Louder.
So the Norodom Sihanouk, he in total he made 50 films between 65 and 69. I just looked it up. There's 10 films and 2 documentaries. Was he making all these films? Did it affect his ability to rule? It seems like quite a lot.
That was the view of many people, yeah. He took his eye off the ball towards the end. He spent too much time making films, and he angered his own party. So, simple answer, yeah, he took his eye off the ball. Too busy making films and enjoying it.
He used to use Roland Eng, who was the ambassador in Bangkok in the mid-90s, in his films, including Si Encore and Die, which was an amusing film. But Roland, I used to promise him that I would show extracts from these films if he came to the FCCT. And he would say, if you do that, I will not come. So the response was, well, if you don't come, I will do that. So he used to come in the end. But they were, you know, the diplomatic corps in Phnom Penh used to be summoned to the palace to watch the films, and they just dreaded it. It was just so boring. Anyway, I digress.
Thank you. Very interesting. And just before I ask my question, I'll say I was in Cambodia for Christmas 1968.
Were you?
I was shown around Angkor Wat by a young lycée, 17-year-old lycée boy speaking perfect French in this very small town that Siem Reap was in those days, just to reinforce your point that there was education spreading throughout the country. But my question, and it sort of follows on what some other people have been saying, how much was this a reaction against the French, the pro-French influence of Sihanouk? I've spent many years in Madagascar. Madagascar became independent in 1960. They had a very pro-French regime. There were the 68 events in France. The people they called the 68ards, the 68ers, came into positions of power. There was a revolution in the early 70s. The president of Madagascar in 75, he wasn't the Khmer Rouge. He thought Kim Il-sung was the answer to all Madagascar's problems. They managed to reduce the GDP per capita by 40% in 20 years. Not the Khmer Rouge, but still not good for Madagascar. I mean, my question is really, you think that the Khmer Rouge was partly this backlash against a regime that was too pro-French?
Simple answer would be no, I don't think it is. I think they were just communists who were initially the Khmer Rouge were an agrarian reform movement. And if you think back to the 60s, most of the, half the world had agrarian reform parties. Obviously in North Vietnam, Viet Minh. In Laos, there was the Pathet Lao. The Philippines, I think, had the New People's Army. Peru had the Shining Path. There were the Sandinistas. Communist parties were everywhere, and they were all agrarian reform, totalitarian parties. People wearing green hats with red stars, equal poverty for all, except for the big boys at the top. That was the usual. And I don't think that the Khmer Rouge were any different. They started out as an agrarian reform movement. They gained huge strength after the bombing of the east of the country when people fled the bombing. And after the coup in 1970, the Lon Nol coup in 1970, after which Sihanouk, working on the principle of my enemy is my friend, he declared for the Khmer Rouge, clearly not knowing what was going to be happening 5 years later. But no, I don't. My simple answer to your question is no. I don't think the Khmer Rouge were there saying we're going to attack this regime and take over the country because we don't like the French. No, I think they just didn't like anybody. They were just another totalitarian regime, just another one, of which there were many.
You mentioned the relationship with Lee Kuan Yew when Singapore was looking to Cambodia as an example.
Yep.
And it was a period of incredible insecurity, and Sihanouk actually offered Lee Kuan Yew a bolt hole. If things went wrong, if something flared up with Malaysia at that time, then there was an understanding that they could go to Cambodia. It's an amazing
extraordinary,
thing.
isn't it? Extraordinary.
And then you had ASEAN formed, and the ASEAN was formed as a response to the Vietnam War and how to deal with communism, etc. Primarily, it's a different story today.
Yeah.
And basically, you talked about Lon Nol and the coup, the American back coup, which should not be forgotten.
Mm-hmm.
And Sihanouk was away at the time and felt immensely betrayed by the fact that the Singaporeans didn't come to his rescue, that the ASEANis ignored him, and he went to Beijing and he made his famous speech, his radio broadcast, and then he came back in with the Khmer Rouge-led front, and ended up imprisoned in the Grand Palace in Phnom Penh with his son Sihamuni, who's now the king, and he did not even know who Pol Pot was. He'd never laid.
Really?
Yeah, it was a most extraordinary story. But I bring it up. But if there aren't any more questions, I'll just try and end on a slightly positive note. I mean, we've had a very unfortunate experience this year of disagreement between Cambodia and Thailand. But it's worth remembering that over 500,000 Khmer were able to take refuge in Thailand during the 1980s and find sanctuary here. The Thais did the right thing at the time. And the reason I bring that up is that you've shown Bupa Devi, the daughter, Ranarid's sister, who would dance for the visitors. Famously, Sukarno fell in love with her when he saw her dance. But the first time I saw Bupa Devi was in Site B, at a refugee camp, and these refugee camps were bigger than almost all the settlements in Cambodia itself. They were refugee camps. And Bupa Devi was in a split bamboo hut teaching the Royal Ballet. It was the most extraordinary thing. And so the ballet was kept alive inside the camps in Thailand. So the Thai role in this is not nearly as negative as we would take away from recent developments, and hopefully it can be salvaged. Anyway, Stephen, a wonderful evening.
Thank you very much.
Congratulations on persisting with it. If you light the fuse, things will follow.
Right.
Sorry, there's
Yeah.
somebody else.
Not really a question, more like a comment to add to your positive note at the end. Since we're talking about music and architecture and films, and some of you asked about new generation. So I think it's worthy to note that in around 2010, there was a French-Cambodian young man who, born in Paris, Cambodian parents, decided to move back to Cambodia and investigate the past of his family. His grandfather was one of the biggest movie producers in Phnom Penh in the 60s. And from all this research, he started with organizing a festival celebrating Cambodian cinema, Cambodian music. At that time, Sihanouk was alive, and he even got permission from the palace to show to screen some of Sihanouk's films that the palace still had records of. And this resulted in a wonderful documentary called Golden Slumbers, that actually, I think it was even presented off competition at the Festival de Cannes. And this young man has since become a very renowned filmmaker. His name is Davi Chu. He actually won a prize at the film festival in Cannes recently, I think 2 years ago, for a fiction, which is not related to Cambodia. But the bottom line is, he lives in Cambodia. He created a film community, a collective, with 3-4 Cambodian filmmakers who are collecting prizes across the world. And all this somehow is inspired from what Cambodia achieved in the 60s. And this is very, very beautiful to see, and it's a wonderful way of linking that period to some sort of a new renewal of arts and creativity in Cambodia that's happening now, of course, to a lesser extent, and of course, less support from the government, or maybe no support from the government, I don't know. And also maybe one more comment on the music. So, you know, the rock, they called garage rock or psychedelic rock of Cambodia of the 60s, has also been kind of inspiring for a lot of musicians, including one band from Los Angeles called Dengue Fever. And that band in the 90s discovered Cambodia's psychedelic rock, and they were mesmerized by it. I think one of them was a backpacker in Cambodia, and one of these musicians, and he was like, oh, I can't believe this music exists. And now this band also has become very, very popular, very famous. They provided a soundtrack from Jim Jarmusch's movies, and they do concerts. Sometimes they come back to Cambodia. Another band is called the Cambodian Space Project. Again, heavily inspired by this psychedelic rock. It still exists, still doing concerts, so I recommend you look them up. They also do covers, and also, most importantly, they remastered the surviving songs from the 60s, so they are available in very good quality. So I encourage everyone to look them up. And yeah, my name is Balaz, and I lived 7 years in Cambodia. I worked at that time at the Khmer Rouge trials, prosecuting former Khmer Rouge leaders. So that's how I got exposure, and this is what I did in my part-time. And thank you very much for this wonderful research and all your hard work that you did to shed a bit more light on this part of Cambodia's history and culture. I myself was fascinated, and I have a collection of posters from the 60s, of course, reproductions, but it's always good to see that other people also appreciate that, and maybe it's time to bring it to the world now. So thank you very much. Thank you so much.
Are you a member of the FCCT?
Say it again, sorry?
Are you a member of the FCCT?
Well, not yet.
I think you're about to be.
You can rectify that afterwards.
Thanks.
And anybody else who hasn't joined or has forgotten to renew, please do. We're the most unexclusive club in Bangkok. Anybody can join, so contribute to the renewal of the FCCT. Stephen, thank you very much.
My pleasure. Thank you.